So I'll just begin. One thing about the handout is that the handout more or less tracks the progress of the paper, but it's really just there for any assistance that you might need, or just checking on details. So I'll start with a quote from the Apology. To fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, to think that one knows what one does not know. Distinctive Socratic points of view are evident in this passage. First, Socrates gives an indication here that his view of the emotions, in this case fear, is a cognitivist one. Note the way he explains fear here in cognitive terms. Socrates seems to think that emotions just are beliefs. Second, it's familiar to anyone who has read Plato's early dialogues that Socrates regards thinking one knows what one does not know to be the worst kind of ignorance, the kind that he targets in his Olympic examinations for others. Just as Socrates identifies virtue with knowledge, so too he identifies vice with ignorance. It follows that Socrates has a very dim view of the ethical status of nearly everyone that he meets and talks to in Plato's early dialogues. Given Socrates' explicit assessment of human epistemic achievement, it may not seem surprising that he finds so many people guilty of so many false or unjustified beliefs. In this paper, we'll focus on one especially problematic epistemic failure that Socrates encounters, one that, as our title has it, is both ubiquitous and also intractable. We seek to explain why Socrates thinks that so many people seem to believe that death was a bad thing. The fear of death, he says, is tantamount to believing that one knows what one does not know. But why, we wonder, do so many people that Socrates encounters commit this error? Indeed, not a single Socratic interlocutor appears in the early dialogues gives any indication that he does not fear death. If the fear of death is an example of the most blameworthy ignorance, as Socrates says, why are so many people ignorant in this way? Why is Socrates' own view of the matter a recognition of his ignorance with respect to death, and thus no fear of it, since, as he says of himself, I shall never fear or avoid things which I do not know whether they may be good or bad? Why is his view so rare as to be effectively unique among his contemporaries? Socrates' expression of the error made by those who fear death seems unusually harsh and overstated. It seems harsh and overstated because the way he puts it here makes it sound as if he thinks that anyone who acts out of a fear of death indicates a false conceit of knowledge. But surely he was aware that people may often realize that they don't know something, but act only on the basis of what they believe. Despite his harsh rhetoric here, we do not need to assume that Socrates actually thought that people who feared death all supposed that they knew it was a bad thing. The most arrogant of Socrates' interlocutors, such as Thrasymachus or Callicles, are revealed to think that they actually know things that they don't know. But not every ancient Athenian made this sort of mistake every time they acted on their beliefs. So no doubt Socrates was well aware that many of his fellow Athenians would agree that they didn't know that death is a bad thing, but nonetheless feared death and would do whatever they could to avoid it. In the passage with which we began, taking these considerations into account, we might suppose that Socrates would claim, were he to state his view more carefully, simply that people's actions, when they act out of a fear of death, are as unjustified ethically as the beliefs that motivate their actions are epistemically unjustified. Socrates is, as most scholars agree, an intellectualist about motivation. Human actions, that is, always reflect what agents believe is best for them at the time of acting, among the options available and salient to them at the time of the action. Such a complaint about lack of justification might not be particularly damning if the justification of an agent simply fell short of the threshold for knowledge, while nonetheless providing good evidential support for the belief in question. So we might begin by wondering whether it's just a relative lack of justification that Socrates is pointing to here. In fact, it seems clear that Socrates regards the problem as much worse than simply that those who fear death fall short of knowing that death is a bad thing. After all, if he thought there were good reasons for thinking that death was a bad thing, even if he also thought that those reasons fell short of the kind of justification he would need to know this, then we would expect Socrates too to fear death as something that he believed was likely to be bad. Instead, he treats the issue as if there is no justificatory support for the belief at all. If there's no support for either evaluation, then his criticism seems apt. If this is the sort of error that Socrates believes people are making when it comes to death, our question is motivated. If there's no good reason for any belief about whether death is a good or a bad thing, why does almost everyone Socrates meets fear it as a bad thing? One might expect that on issues where there's no evidentiary support for belief one way or the other, the majority of people would refrain from belief, or if they did have beliefs on the subject, they might be expected to fall more or less randomly on either side of the question. Plainly, that's not the case when it comes to the question of whether death is bad and thus to be feared. As one reads further into the Apology, however, one's impression of the kind of error that's made by those who fear death becomes even worse. It would be bad enough if Socrates only thought that the correct attitude toward death was complete agnosticism. But Socrates' third speech in the Apology shows that the error made by those who fear death is even worse than thinking that they have justification when there's none to be had. Instead, the error that they make is actually false belief. They believe that death is bad, and actually there's good evidence, Socrates seems to think, that in fact it's good for those who die and not bad at all. If this is the nature of the error, then our question becomes even more puzzling. Why would so many people, indeed almost everyone that Socrates encounters, have this particular false belief? Why don't more people accept the true belief that Socrates thinks is better justified than the belief that death will be bad for the one who has died? Moreover, if there's good evidence that death is not a bad thing, why is it so difficult to get people to accept that evidence? To sum up, there are two questions we wish to answer in this paper. First, why do so many people believe what they do about death? And why is it that belief is so resistant to rational persuasion? Our argument will show that the contents of beliefs are not all that matters. Rather, how and by what belief-forming process the beliefs come into being also matters a great deal as to how readily one's beliefs can be changed by argument. We'll advance our attempt to answer this question in stages. In the next section, we consider possible explanations for the ubiquity and intractability of the false belief that death is bad, and show why what might seem to be the most plausible of these actually do not adequately explain why so many people are so resistant to reason and so wrong about death. In section 3, we go on to offer an alternative explanation for the ubiquity and intractability of this false belief. We close with a few remarks about how the kind of account we offer for false beliefs about death might be applied to other ubiquitous false beliefs that also seem resistant to change in the light of evidence. Before we review the different ways in which Socrates might have tried to understand why people had the beliefs they did about death, a couple of distinctions are in order. First, the arguments Socrates gives in the Apology about the value of death focus on whether being dead will be good or bad for the one who died. His arguments are not about whether the process of dying will be good or bad. Elsewhere, Socrates makes it clear that certain physical ailments can make one's life actually worse than death. And so we might suppose that when the process of dying puts one into such a condition, that process would rightly be regarded as bad for the one undergoing it. Socrates' question and the arguments we review here are concentrated on what happens at or after death and not on whatever may have happened to cause death. Second, Socrates' focus also sets aside other aspects of death, for example, the sight and stench of rotting corpses or the grief attendant to the loss of a loved one, which could well count as bad things for those who witness them, but are no evidence of what it might be like to be dead for the one who has died. Given these stipulations, then, we may ask how Socrates might have understood the way that people come to believe, as they so obviously did, that being dead would be bad for the one who died. Contemporary epistemologists have recognized several different belief-forming processes, including perception, memory, deduction, induction, abduction, and testimony. If we consider which of these might have contributed to the ubiquity of the belief that death is a bad thing, we will confront a puzzle. As for perception, no one who's alive can observe one's own death, nor can one get any significant evidence for what death is like for the dead person just from third-person observations of the effects of death on the body of one who has died. There are a few mythological cases in which people have claimed to observe the afterlife, but no one, or at least no one that Socrates speaks to in Plato's early dialogues, claims to have had such an experience, and even if they had an experience of an afterlife, what they reported would end up amounting to a form of testimony for anyone else that they might tell about it. As for memory, no one can remember being dead. The process by which people come to think that death is a bad thing cannot be memory either. There do not seem to be any premises for anyone thinks are sufficiently secure to proceed with a deduction about the value of death. It's not induction either, because it's impossible both to be alive and to have experiences of death that one can use inductively. The same may be said for abduction, or the inference to the best explanation. The problem with all these forms of reasoning is that they require multiple experiences of the relevant sort, but we only get to experience death for ourselves just once, and it's at that time that we're considering when we ask whether death will be a good thing or a bad. Socrates' notion that death could be like a dreamless sleep, which he argues for in his third speech of the Apology, might be derived from a kind of observation and abduction, observations of others who had died who appeared to be in a condition very like dreamless sleep. Nevertheless, the inference, they look like they're asleep, to death is like sleep, is evidently not secured by any of the above-mentioned kinds of belief generation. Even so, witnessing the immobility of the dead could have the effect of persuading the living witness that death could at least could be a succession of experience, and thus all positive experience, such as joy, pleasure, and entertainment. Anyone who had anticipated a pleasure, for example, can recall that failing to achieve that pleasure might count just by itself as a relative harm. If death is like unconsciousness, then, one might suppose that there's at least some evidence that death could be a bad thing for the one who can never again enjoy the positive experiences that can make life enjoyable. On the one hand, however, insofar as this is the sort of reasoning involved in the ubiquity of the belief that death is bad, it is reasoning that Socrates would reject. We note that such reasoning amounts to what psychologists and social psychologists have called the mere exposure effect, or the familiarity principle, which is a form of cognitive bias that shows undue preference for whatever is more familiar. From the fact that we prefer the devil we know, as the saying goes, it hardly follows that such a preference can be rationally sustained, especially when the alternative remains completely unknown and thus unevaluable. Even if this way of reasoning is common, as it surely is, it cannot explain the degree to which death is regarded as bad. At best, it can explain, without actually justifying, the preference for remaining alive. More is needed, as we'll explain later in this paper, to explain the degree to which death is abhorred. People don't simply prefer life to death, as the familiarity bias would lead them to do, but positively and very forcefully regard death as a disaster to them. On the other hand, as we've noted above, from the fact that dead people seem not to be experiencing anything, it hardly follows that their souls have not simply departed from their bodies and gone elsewhere, one of the options that Socrates presents in the third speech of the Apology, where death is characterized as one of two things. Socrates also reminds his jurors of their own happy willingness to surrender to unconsciousness each night. He says, quote, "If death is like a complete lack of perception, like a dreamless sleep, then death would be a great advantage, end quote. From these kinds of considerations, it seems that from among the options offered by contemporary epistemologists, the only explanation Socrates could have relied on for why nearly everyone believes that death is a bad thing would be the kind of testimonial evidence that can be received through enculturation. Did the ancient Greeks of Socrates' time have a sufficiently uniform and universal view of the value of death to explain why almost everyone Socrates meets thinks that death is a bad thing? Here too, however, the actual evidence provided in Greek cultural depictions of death and the afterlife cannot explain the ubiquity or the intractability of the belief that death is bad. It's true that some of the depictions of death and the afterlife available to Socrates' fellow Athenians were not particularly hopeful. For example, the gloomy picture of the afterlife in Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey. If Homer were the only source for Greeks to consider what death might be like, it would be reasonable to conclude that the widespread belief that death was a bad thing could be explained in terms of Homer's influence. But neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey were considered to be dogmatic religious texts in which all ancient Greeks believed or had to believe, nor were they the only accounts available to the ancient Greeks. Other characterizations of death and the afterlife, also offered by respected authors and religious traditions, provided different pictures of what death might be like. A very different conception of the value of death is provided by many sources. For example, in a famous story which Herodotus ascribed to Solon, who would count Cleobus and Beton as the second happiest human beings. When their mother wished to go to a feast for Hera, the two young men yoked themselves to the cart and pulled it 5 miles to the site of the feast. Grateful and pleased with them, she prayed to the goddess to give her sons, quote, that gift which is best for a man to receive. Whereupon both died in their sleep after they sacrificed and feasted. Cleobus and Beton died young, and the young are supposed to live longer. But as Solon concludes, quote, in this the deity declared that it was better for a man to die than to continue to live, end quote. While obviously presenting a very unfavorable assessment of the human condition, this story in Herodotus plainly reverses the relative values of life and death from what we're given in the Odyssey. Another important alternative to the Homeric picture of death and the afterlife may be found in the very popular belief in classical culture about a sort of family reunion in Hades, where the long-established dead greet the new arrivals. An illustration of this belief may be seen in the prominent grave stele of Amphitrite. The pleasant anticipation that family members will meet in the afterlife could help survivors to come to terms with their own grief, but it also presents a much brighter picture of life after death than one finds in Homer. The idea of the post-mortem judgment of the souls to be traced to Pindar's Olympian ode, Pindar says, quote, a judge below the earth holds trial, end quote, assigning delightful existence for the good, insufferable toil for the bad. Further, Aeschylus in the Eumenides and Suppliants mentions just punishment in Hades for sinners' misdeeds. Plato relies on this theme in the myths in the Apology and Gorgias. Given these depictions, one might conclude that the belief that death is a bad thing cannot derive from the post-mortem judgment myths in ancient Greek culture, because these stories tell us that death is a good thing for virtuous souls and also may have had a corrective and thus beneficial effect even on vicious souls. If so, such myths would have the effect of supporting Socrates' assessment that even for bad people, death will be a benefit. Although our knowledge of the Eleusinian mysteries and Orphism is incomplete and fragmentary, these religious traditions also seem to provide reasons to think that Greek culture did not inevitably depict death as a bad experience for the dead. Evidence of such a favorable attitude towards death in the afterlife is the epitaph of the Hierophant, saying that, quote, death is not only not an evil, but good. Contrary to the Homeric idea of the senseless dead soul, the Eleusinian mysteries provided the view of the immoral soul being, quote, worthy of a better afterlife, end quote. Orphic tablets provide evidence for believing that death is not the end of the mortal progression, but that beyond death, a new life awaits. According to the mysteries, initiation was the most significant condition for the deceased to be worthy of a joyous afterlife. To conclude, there were several distinct cultural hypotheses about death that would have been generally available to Socrates' jurors, and these were inconsistent. Death is annihilation, the soul goes to Hades, which might be bad, but might not be, and death might actually be joyous for those who are reunited with their families in the afterlife, or for those who were good in their lives, or for those who were simply initiated into the mysteries. Accordingly, the ancient Greeks did not have a sufficiently coherent and uniform system of religious beliefs about death and the possibility of an afterlife to allow enculturation to explain why almost everyone that Socrates encountered believed that death is a bad thing. It is, of course, possible that the more memorable and motivating stories within this great diversity of depictions of death in the afterlife were also the ones that were the most terrifying. We will have more to say about how this process might work in the next section, but it's enough for our purposes in this section to note that there was insufficient uniformity in the way death was depicted in Greek culture for the process of enculturation to account for the ubiquity or intransigency of the belief that death is bad. In the previous section, we showed that only faulty reasoning could explain how and why so many of his fellow Athenians believed that death was bad. Other commonly recognized belief-forming processes could not be responsible. So we might now conclude that the only basis for the ubiquity and intractability of the relevant belief is simply the familiarity bias, a form of reason, again, that we think Socrates would rightly reject. But recent scholarship gives us some reason to think that Socrates would explain the etiology of the belief that death is a bad thing in a somewhat different way. So here I'm going to talk about another work with another co-author in third person. In their 2015 paper, Brickhouse and Smith provide an account of how Socrates understood emotions, according to which he's a cognitivist about emotions, but not about appetites. They argue that Socrates acknowledges different etiologies for belief formation and belief supporting processes. Some of them have a non-rational origin, involving our most fundamental natural attractions and aversions. Brickhouse and Smith support their interpretation by referring to Plato's Charmides, 167e, where Socrates seems to distinguish several types of desire which have different targets. Now a quote from Brickhouse and Smith. Quote, "These desires include appetite, epithumia, which aims at pleasure, wish, boulesis, which aims at what is good, and love, eros, which aims at what is beautiful. Each of these seems to have an aversive alternative as well. We avoid pains, what is bad, and what is ugly. Our natural attractions and aversions, we contend, are the grounds for a variety of non-rational beliefs. Insofar as something seems or promises to be pleasurable, beneficial, or beautiful, the agent will naturally be inclined to believe it to be something good. And insofar as something seems to be painful, detrimental, or ugly, the agent will be naturally inclined to believe it to be something bad. Unless the natural inclination to believe in such cases is mitigated or defeated by some other, for example, rational belief-forming process, one will form beliefs about goods and evils accordingly. The beliefs created by these natural attractions and aversions, because they derive from non-rational processes, are veridically unreliable, but are also, to some degree, by their nature as non-rational, resistant to rational persuasion and other belief-forming processes." End quote from Brickhouse and Smith. We claim, we now, Irina, Deretic, and I, claim that this is a kind of non-rational belief-forming process. It is this kind of non-rational belief-forming process, originating in our natural inclinations, that is involved in the widely accepted belief that death is bad. According to Plato's Socrates, quote, fear, phobos, or dread, theos, is an expectation, prosdokion, of something bad. That's Protagoras 358d. So here again, we find Socrates' cognitivism about the nature of fear. To be clear, however, Socrates does not think that all fear involves false belief. He speaks in the Apology and elsewhere as if the experience of fear in the face of something an agent knows to be bad is appropriate. In each case, Socrates shows that what we should fear most of all is the corruption of our souls through the commission of injustice. In cases where fear is appropriate, it may have its basis in our aversion to what is detrimental, as damage to our souls surely is. But given our full suite of basic attractions and aversions, not all instances of negative emotions, such as fear, will have the same aversive basis. In some cases, Socrates seems to think that our aversion to pain can generate fear. From the fact that the fear is based on the agent's aversion to pain, it doesn't follow that this emotion is non-cognitive. Rather, in the account that Brickus and Smith give, one's aversion to pain will naturally incline one to believe that anything that threatens to cause pain is bad. But since such emotions and cognitions in the Socratic view, our experience of them allows us to consider and evaluate whether they track truth, and thus potentially to resist the temptation to believe that something will be bad for us simply because it may involve some natural aversion that we feel. Since Socrates thinks there are good reasons to think that death is not bad for the one who dies, then it is, in his view, irrational to be afraid of it. Nevertheless, given the natural processes by which fears are generated, even if one were to acquire some sort of plausible evidence of there being a favorable afterlife, as we have found it would have been possible in Greek culture to obtain, the recognition of such evidence as evidence would not automatically and effectively preclude the fear of death. Rather, the fear of death does not seem to recede in the light of rational argument, as Emily Austin has argued, which makes the cognitive error involved particularly problematic. If indeed the belief that death is bad has its etiological origin in non-rational desires and aversions, as Brickhouse and Smith suggested, then only someone who has failed to have such desires or aversions would be entirely immune to the disposition to form this belief. But Socrates never seems to indicate any way that someone could actually eliminate these most basic desires and aversions. In the Protagoras, Socrates explains how the craft of measurement could be our salvation from misleading appearances of value, which Brickhouse and Smith also explain in terms of the influence of non-rational attractions and aversions. But such salvation is not achieved by eliminating the appearances or by eliminating the desires that are either responsible for them or at least responsive to them. The problem with this solution to the problem of the veridical unreliability of this particular belief-forming process is that the knowledge required for the craft of measurement does not seem to be available. No one is wiser than Socrates, according to the oracle given to Chaerephon, but not even Socrates has the saving craft of measurement. So we not only cannot get rid of the unreliable process of forming beliefs on the basis of desires and aversions, neither can we completely neutralize our inclinations to form beliefs in this way through knowledge. Instead, Socrates prescribes two distinct approaches for minimizing our vulnerability to this unreliable cognitive process. The first of these is perhaps his most famous claim that, quote, "It is the greatest good for a human being to discuss virtue every day, and these other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being," end quote. This high level of philosophical activity, it seems, will put us in the best position we can be in for identifying any errors we might have had in our thinking about what is best and what is most valuable to us. But even this way of life is no complete or absolute assurance that we will not continue to be vulnerable to the cognitive effects of strong desires within us. The second approach that Socrates offers to diminish our vulnerability to this unreliable cognitive process is to keep the very appetitive urges that are their basis in what he calls a disciplined condition in the Gorgias. The weaker we can make our appetites, says Socrates, the more self-controlled we become. And this will also allow us to do a better job of at least giving due consideration to other more reliable cognitive processes that will make when we make our most important decisions in life. But this too takes considerable dedication and does not offer any absolute guarantee of success, since the desires themselves will still be within us, making what is not really valuable appear to be very valuable to us. Without interference or contradiction by some more reliable cognitive process, we will always be inclined to believe what our appetites seem to make plausible. The power of this unreliable process can be reduced, it seems, but never entirely eliminated. Socrates seems to think that our natural attraction to pleasure and aversion to pain is the ground for many of the errors that we make in evaluation. But supposing that our aversion to pain explains our fear of death only produces a different problem. Why would anyone think that being dead was painful? Of course, it may sometimes be that the process of dying will involve significant pain. But if this is what we really feared, then no one would fear a painless death. We suspect instead that there's another basic instinct that Socrates might point to as the source of our fear of death. All human beings share the will to survive, which is deeply rooted in our nature and seems to be, whether conscious or not, part of what it means to be a living thing. Plants grow in ways that allow them to make the best of their environment to survive, and all animals struggle against anything that threatens their survival. The aversive alternative of one's struggle to survive is one's resistance to the end of one's own life. So the etiology of the fear of death seems to be based in this kind of resistance, a basic instinct so natural for human beings that it explains the ubiquity of what Socrates thinks is the false, but also almost universal belief that death is bad. Human self-protective reactions can be based both on rational and also irrational assessments of threats. And an example of the former can be a situation in which a commander of a military unit realistically makes the assessment that it's better to withdraw his unit than to attack enemies when they're stronger in number or weapons. By contrast, the fear of death often causes irrational behavior, particularly when it's based on our refusal to accept the fact that all of us will necessarily die. Because of its non-rational etiology, the fear of death frequently has an influence in creating inadequate assessments of what really matters in our lives, and thus creating inappropriate conduct. An example, and in Socrates' time well known, an excellent example of the irrational fear of death can be found in Homer's Iliad, Book 22, where Athena warns her father Zeus, who for a moment wants to save Hector from death, that Hector, as a man, is doomed to his destiny, end quote, to the fate of being mortal. Even the highest of all Olympic gods cannot change the predestined nature of human beings, the fact that they are mortal and perishable. Recall Hector's conduct when facing his own death. In the Iliad, he is characterized as the most courageous and noblest among the Trojans, who are generally more favorably depicted by Homer than are the Achaeans. Hector doesn't fight for pride or glory, but to defend and protect his own family and country, being wholly devoted to them. Hector's response to the approach of Achilles is thus surprising to the reader. Quote, "The shivers took hold of Hector when he could no longer stand his ground there, but left his gates behind and fled and frightened, and Peleus' son went after him in confidence of his quick feet," end quote. We would expect Hector to know that he should and must fight with Achilles. He has only two options. He must bravely face Achilles now, or else he will convict himself of cowardice by running, only to have to face Achilles soon again in the future. Either way, Hector knows that Achilles will kill him. Against the raging Achilles, Hector knows he has no hope of victory. What he has to do is behave in the way that's appropriate for a brave and noble Trojan prince. He will die either way, so all he really risks until then is disgrace and dishonor. And yet he runs. We may feel compassion for his temporary moral failure, precisely because we can relate to what Hector surely felt when he saw Achilles approaching. Why did Homer dramatize in such a manner the last moments of his both most heroic and also most tragic character? Why is the best hero doomed to end his life in such a way? Homer provides his readers with an answer. Hector wants to escape, quote, death spirits, end quote, from whom he cannot really run away because he's a mortal man, though being the most excellent among mortals. By dramatizing Hector's last moments, Homer seems to intend to show that the fear of death is so overwhelming and powerful that it can sometimes prevent even the most exemplary of men from conducting themselves in an apt and dignified fashion. Now, it may have been Homer's intent, and may also have been the inclination of Homer's readers, to view this episode as a classic instance of akrasia, where Hector's better judgment is simply overcome by fear. But Socrates could not see Hector's behavior in such a way, since he also denies that anyone ever acts in such a way that is contrary to what that person judges to be in his or her best interest among the options available and salient to the agent at the time of action. For Socrates, the explanation of Hector's behavior must be that he experiences a fluctuation in his cognitive system, struggling with competing belief-forming and belief-sustaining processes. Hector's unusual calm and measured judgment, which Homer makes especially evident and poignant in a famous scene in Book 6, is to go bravely to his fate. But his natural instinct for survival and aversion to extinction leads him to believe, for a time, that he must do anything to survive. So he runs. And in running, Socrates would claim that Hector was doing what he believed was best for him at that time. This belief, however, Homer shows, and Socrates would agree, is false. Hector's behavior thus exemplifies the risk of allowing our natural appetites and instincts to have their effects on us, allowing them to operate without the discipline Socrates recommends in the Gorgias. The irrational fear of death, as Socrates points out, frequently keeps us from acting virtuously and in accordance with the values we normally accept by perhaps temporarily occluding those values and replacing them with the false belief that right now we will do better if we act in ways that are contrary to those values. If our argument in this section is correct, then, the fear of death is, in Socrates' opinion, to be explained in terms of the most fundamental natural urge that is inherent to all living things. We are powerfully averse to anything that threatens our survival, even though we're able to see that none of us will survive forever, and may also agree that survival at the cost of virtue is no real benefit. Hector's example illustrates that his strong will to survive is resistant to his habituation and upbringing, and is also and to his usually accepted system of evaluative beliefs. This explanation of the etiology of the particular false belief that death is bad allows us to understand why Socrates' philosophical argumentation may not change an interlocutor's mind about this issue. Unless we habituate ourselves to follow only the most reliable paths of belief formation, we will typically find that non-rational belief formation will be stronger in us than our responses even to arguments that we recognize as good ones. To fear death is defeasible because it's grounded on a non-rational aversion, which might be opposed by another, more reliable cognitive process, such as, for example, considering the evidence that Socrates reviews in his argument in the third speech of the Apology. Only knowledge of what is good and what is bad, the craft of measurement, would provide us with an absolutely reliable way to resist one of our most powerful belief-forming processes. For those who lack such knowledge, the ability to sustain a balance between natural instinct and other belief-forming processes that are more veridically reliable will require vigilance and dedication, and can only be achieved to some degree. In depicting its degree of achievement by Socrates, Plato provides us with an exemplar even more noble and more admirable than the most famous prince of Troy. So just a concluding section. In this paper, we've attempted to argue a question that's never explicitly raised in Plato's early dialogues, and thus also never explicitly answered there, which is, why is the fear of death so common as to be nearly universal? The basis of the answer we've given and argued is that the only answer that Plato's Socrates might have been able to give, is that among the attractions and aversions that are naturally included in our humanity, there is a specific aversion to having one's life come to an end. Now, just saying it without the argumentation we provided might seem to be not particularly interesting. What makes the question we've pursued in this paper more challenging, however, is a feature of Socratic philosophy that is not widely accepted by contemporary readers. Socrates is a cognitivist about emotion. He thinks that emotions just are beliefs. So the question, why does everybody fear death, counts to Socrates as a question about belief. Why does everyone seem to believe that death is a bad thing? The ubiquity of this fear, in other words, is just ubiquity of a certain belief about death. We also noted that the specific belief in question is one that Socrates seems to think is false, and is moreover a belief for which the only evidence available to Greeks of Socrates' time was a highly varied mixture of myths and depictions of death, only some few of which would incline those who accepted them to think that death was bad. The false belief about death, accordingly, cannot be explained in terms of anything specific to Greek culture, and we argued that all of the other belief-forming processes that epistemologists generally recognize also could not explain the ubiquity of the belief that Socrates himself doubts. Therefore, our question became one about etiologies of belief, and which one of these might allow Socrates to explain just why almost everyone else seemed to believe what he thought was false. In the end, we found only one possibility, and that one may be unfamiliar to our readers. We argued that, that only the etiology of non-rational belief formation, as proposed by Brickhouse and Smith, could answer our question. And once we noted that, we also found that this same etiology could explain not just how false beliefs about death come to be so commonly accepted, but also why it is that such false belief seem to be particularly resistant to change, even in the face of contrary evidence. Indeed, our explanation can also serve to explain a phenomenon that may also be found in Plato's early dialogues, when Socrates presents some of his most intransigent interlocutors with reasons against some belief they've expressed. Rather than respond rationally, the interlocutors seem to resist reason even more energetically. They double down on the beliefs that Socrates has called into question. This response, too, seems to call for an explanation of how people come to have beliefs or sustain those beliefs in the face of contrary evidence that has an etiological source in a non-rational psychological process. By supposing that human beings have a potent, natural belief-forming process that is nonetheless vertically unreliable, Socrates can explain how and why it is that so many human beings make so many moral errors. But since we have other, more veridically reliable belief-forming processes, for example, leading the examined life, subjecting our beliefs and our dispositions to believe to critical evaluation, and regarding reasoning as our most reliable epistemic process, we're not doomed to error and can do much better in the formation and sustaining of moral beliefs. False evaluative beliefs, that is, false beliefs about whether something is good or bad, pose special risks, according to Socrates. Since he's also an intellectualist about motivation, he thinks that absolutely every time that we go wrong when we act, it's because we're acting on a false evaluative belief. We always act on the basis of what we think is best for us from among the options of which we're aware at the time of acting. Therefore, if we go wrong, it's because we've made a cognitive error. But this cognitive error, we noted, is almost universally accepted, this particular one. It follows that people are especially vulnerable to moral errors when their decisions have to take into account that certain paths they may take could be fatal. We consider that it's an important aspect of Socrates' views, but we think too that the explanation we've offered for these sorts of moral errors can also be more broadly applied, and so we wanted to close by at least gesturing at such an application. We've argued that Socrates could not have supposed that enculturation could provide a sufficient explanation for the ubiquity and intractability of the belief that death will be bad for the one who dies. It may be that enculturation could provide at least part of the explanation of many of the false ethical beliefs that Socrates finds in his interlocutors. For example, their overestimation of the values of wealth or reputation. But even here we suggest, with many other false moral beliefs that prove to be resistant to rational persuasion, we may also see a non-rational etiology of cognition at work. It may be that people come to hold conventional ethical views simply because they're conventional. Lying behind many such conventional, and to Socrates ethically mistaken beliefs, however, may lurk the very kinds of non-rational processes that we have discussed in this paper. People may hold on to conventional moral ethical errors, even in the face of good reasons to reject such views, because these errors are sustained by desiderative processes that are mostly immune to rational persuasion. We focused on how this kind of desiderative function finds so many people to fear what should not be feared. What we have proposed herein might help us to explain how our irrational, strong natural urges can be overruled and disciplined by habituating to act in accordance with the less defeasible and more reliable beliefs in order to obtain, to the degree achievable in human beings, the knowledge of what is good and bad. Our explanation can thus shed light on a much wider and more troubling problem. Why is it that Socrates can never find anyone wiser than he is? And thus, why is it that Socrates, for all his professed ignorance of the most important things, may be represented by Plato as the best and most excellent among us, an exemplar among human beings? Thank you so much for paying attention.